day. Almost 25,000 have been reported. But Professor in Global Public Health, Devi Sridhar, says it's hard to say whether we're past the peak of a third wave.
Confirmed cases have fallen, but actually test positivity has increased. And what that reflects is that possibly fewer people are getting tested, while the ONS survey, which is the survey that's randomly sent out to households to assess community infection, actually shows an increase.
The family of a 13-year-old who was stabbed to death by two teenagers in Reading say he was a warm, kind person. Two boys, aged 14, have been found guilty of murdering Oliver Stevens, who was lured to a field in Emma Green in January before being attacked. Team GB are celebrating winning 3 gold medals in Tokyo 2020. Swimmer Adam Peaty and mountain biker Tom Pidcock won their events, while divers Tom Daly and Matty Lee also took gold. In the city, the FTSE 100 closed down 2 points at 70.25, and the pound buys $1.38 and €1.17. And the weather, showery rain in Northern Ireland will move into western Scotland and England this evening. Most other areas dry, showers becoming widespread tomorrow with warm spells in between, a high of 22. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Simon English.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 8 on LBC. I'm Iain Dale. Welcome to Cross Question. Let me introduce our panel to you. Professor Anand Menon is the Director of UK in a Changing Europe. We have the journalist Ian Birrell with us, Baroness Brinton, former President of the Liberal Democrats, and Shaun Bailey, Conservative Greater London Assembly member and, of course, former mayoral candidate. They're here to take your questions. The lines are open, 0345 6060 973. The cameras are on as well if you want to watch us on Global Player, on the LBC website at lbc.co.uk, or the YouTube, Facebook and Twitter feeds from LBC.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Let's go to Adrian in Lewisham. He's our first caller. Adrian, what would you like to ask?
Yeah, well, my worry is about all these floods we've had. We've had floods in China, in Germany, in Belgium, and now in the UK, with hundreds lost. We all think this is a lot to do with climate change. And then we hear about the big climate change of ice sheets melting. How long can I think my daughter or my granddaughter will be safe to live in a city like London before that gets flooded completely?
Shaun Bailey.
You're correct to say that London is a low-lying city, hence the Thames barrier. I remember sitting in a meeting and people talking about reviewing, do we replace the barrier, do we increase its capacity? So I think there's a job to be done there. And look, we don't know what the world water level will be at. Yes, there's global warming. We've had floods in the past. We'll certainly have floods in the future. But it does look like the levels are going up. And I think as a country, we have been sort of B+ maybe at flood defences. I think we do need to have a real review of them.
That's being generous.
Yeah, well, OK, but I am being generous, but I do think we need to have a real look at flood defences, particularly in a place like London where I don't feel like it's on everybody's mind.
Because you got the barrier, haven't we, in the Thames? But that will soon, I think, be out of date, won't it? I read somewhere.
That's right, and that's why we're looking at...
Obsolete was the word I was looking for.
That's correct, and that's why people are looking at replacing it. I haven't heard what we'd replace it with, but I think there's flooding further afield in London that needs to be looked at as well, and of course our sewer system, which often gets blocked and flooded. I do know that we're building a Thames Tideway tunnel, a 22-kilometre tunnel underneath the Thames to take care of floodwater, so our capacity is increasing, but I don't know if that will be coming online quick enough.
Brinton, it's clear that there are lots of events happening throughout the world that are extreme weather events. I mean, there have been extreme weather events throughout time, I suppose, but there do seem to be an awful lot at the moment. But what do we do about, I mean, like yesterday, the deluge that central London experienced, I was driving through at the time, it was quite something to behold. But there is nothing that can be done in the short term to ameliorate the effects of a deluge like that, is there?
Well, I think if you look at European cities where they are sadly used to this sort of deluge, they actually build large runoff areas, so almost like river motorways which look dry for large chunks of the year but can cope with these deluges. It's very much something that people living in much warmer countries that are used to this it is one of the factors of climate change, and it may be we have to start to think very seriously about some of the emergency methods of coping with this and diverting water. I mean, it's not just London. If you look at what's been happening in Germany, in Belgium, in the Netherlands as well in recent days, it's very, very worrying.
But what would you do in the short term? Because you can't suddenly improve the sewerage system or the drainage system. They are there to stay. I don't see what can be done in the short term.
Well, I think there are some very key things that can be done in the short term, which aren't a miracle solution for everything. But for example, some councils are not particularly good at clearing the drains and the gutters, or the water companies for those as well, the runoffs. And some of those block back quite quickly, which means that then you get water building up. Now, I'm not suggesting yesterday's deluge would have resolved that, but there's certainly things that can be thought about. The other is thinking about how we react, and it being normal for anyone who lives in an area that is likely to get flooded to know exactly what to do and what advice to get and the sort of things they should be thinking about. Because, again, I grew up on the edge of Rumney Marsh in Kent, and we were always aware that for certain people, there were times when they might be asked to evacuate if the sea wall went, for example. And I'm afraid that's the sort of emergency thinking we need to get into to help protect people and help them to protect their belongings.
Ian Birrell, you travel the world quite a lot with your work. Are you seeing sort of examples of climate change affecting weather in all around the world?
I think there's no doubt when you look at what's happening. We were told that climate change was really going to lead to far more unpredictable weather patterns, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing it in, look at Finland as having record heat at the moment. You look at what's happening in Canada and the west coast of America. You look at what's happening in China right now as well, with flooding in China. Around the world, we're seeing changes in the weather patterns. You see it in the Sahel area, where it's having huge impact on population. You're seeing water crisis at the moment in the Middle East, in a place like Iraq. And I think what we have to do as society is really wake up and think about what this means for us. The caller's talked about his children and his grandchildren. Well, they're the people we need to focus on and start thinking, how do we change as society? In a way, we've done the easy bit so far. It doesn't affect us. If we switch to renewable energies, we still flick a switch and we get electricity in our house. What we've got to think about are things like how we eat, how we live, how we travel. These are really profound questions which we need to start grappling with, and they're uncomfortable. I think 46% of carbon emissions actually come from the way that we transport food, from the way that we live and the way we consume goods. All of this we have to look at. Industry is doing a lot of stuff, but it has to be pushed far faster, far further. And as a society, we've really got to grapple with, do we all need to eat less meat, and do we need to travel less? And, I'm very guilty. I travel all over the world all the time. So I've got to face this just like everyone else.
But you are exposing evil throughout the world, and you should carry on doing it.
I hope I travel for a good reason, and that's very kind of you to say so. But, for all of us, we do need to think about it. And, of course, it seems very silly, the idea that if I take 2 less flights a day, that's really going to have an impact when China is building umpteen power stations all the time. But, as a society, and government has to lead on this. And I don't think governments really around the world have been very good on trying to lead these very difficult debates.
Reminder of Adrian's question, do you think we should view this flooding as a sign of things to come? Anand, Menon.
Yes, absolutely. And the thing is, we've got 2 things to do, haven't we? We've got to find ways of dealing with the immediate problems that are caused by the weather we're experiencing these days, which has changed. There's no doubt about it if you look at the data from across the world. And we have to put in place measures to prevent climate change getting worse. And the problem with this is they both require us to do something we're awfully bad at, which is to think long term in terms of political decisions. We need, if possible, the way they talk about it with social care, cross-party consensus, because these aren't decisions we're taking for one parliamentary term. They're decisions that's going to shape our future for the next 20, 30 years plus.
Adrian, let me come back to you. What's your answer to your own question?
Well, in a way, I'm encouraged by what we're hearing, but I think they're missing almost the big picture. I'm not just worried about the deluge from above. I'm worried about rising sea levels from outside. It's not at all, if the Greenland ice sheet goes, it's not at all impossible that we will lose entire cities or entire flat coastal areas. So it's not just a case of, and the Thames barrier, that's just stopping a little bit at the Thames. What's to stop it creeping around the edge, if you like, of the Thames barrier? So to me, the deluge now is a small warning, but the big warning ought to be rising sea levels and thinking of some of our big cities that were built by the coast for a reason, because they want to be by the sea, simply starting to not exist in the lifetime of let's say, your grandchildren, 50 years from now, a bit more than that, I could imagine big cities simply ceasing to exist. And then what are you going to do? And then it'll be too late. So the point is now, it's really about acting quickly and not thinking, well, this is years down the track, so I don't need to worry. So we don't need Boris Johnson to worry about his current time in government. We need him, or somebody at least, to think further down the track than just my time in Parliament.
Which I suppose is what COP26 is all about later in the year. Adrian, thank you for that. Let's go to our next caller. It's David in Croydon. David, hi, what would you like to say?
Hi, Ian. Thank you for your show. It's amazing.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say, with the Olympics starting, and I was kind of tentative about whether the whole Olympics thing should go ahead or not. But I've kind of got on board and loving it. And then seeing Tom Daley this morning at 7 a.m. win his gold medal, and then being very emotional, and then doing his press conference about promoting LGBTI rights, and then seeing the vitriol that's online and just the negativity. And I just think, why can't an Olympic champion be proud of his sport and proud of who he is and proud of his platform?
Well, it's a good question. I suppose we can sum it up in a way as saying, should we let athletes speak out on issues they care about? We've had all of this, of course, with the England footballers in the Euros. And you're right, the vitriol that Tom Daley has attracted today has been quite something to behold. Sal Brinton, your view?
Well, I think your caller is absolutely right, that he should be able to speak and speak passionately, not just about his sport, but about who he is, without fear of the trolls absolutely descending on him and his family. And I'm afraid it's a rather nasty side of our society at the moment that people feel it's perfectly acceptable to do it. And as we know, it isn't just LGBT issues, it's race, there's a whole string of, I think, women, politicians in particular, face an enormous amount of trolling, particularly MPs, for speaking up. And I think it's because people think that they're being anonymous, and they would never say this sort of thing directly to somebody's face. And I'm afraid that we, as members of society, I don't mean we as politicians and journalists, need to call it out if we know it's happening, because it's the only way we're going to really force people to think about what they are saying. They'd be horrified if somebody turned on them and said it about the things that they cared about.
And of course, Anand, Menon, it has the effect of pushing people back in the closet, doesn't it? I mean, if there was a Premier League footballer that was thinking about coming out as gay and then sees all the vitriol that Tom Daley gets, he's inevitably going to think, I'm not sure I want to do this.
Well, absolutely, and you just think about how few footballers have come out as gay, and you know that there's an issue here. I mean, in the question, I think there are two separate issues. The first is sports people, as the word implies, are people, they're citizens, they're voters, they have an absolute right to state their opinions. Equally, people have a right to disagree with them. One of the problems is that social media makes people feel like they're hiding behind a wall or can chuck grenades at will. And I think here we need to think about the regulation of social media, because people get away with the most obscene abuse, seemingly with little in the way of punishment. But I'm all in favour of sports people stating their views, whatever they might be, because I think they have an important platform, and why wouldn't you use it?
It is a bit odd, isn't it, Ian Birrell, that some people think that sports people or actors or people in the media should keep quiet about their views. Why should any sector of society feel that they need to hide their views, their strongly held feelings?
I agree, and I'm not sure really that many people do think that they should be quiet. I think it's been really great the way in recent years, particularly, we've seen sports people stand up for issues they care about and campaign on issues, and I think it's been really impressive. And I think Tom Daley, particularly from the very start, from when he came out, has been a really strong figurehead. He's been very much saying, this is part of who I am, and he's not, he's been very proud of it, quite rightly. And I think people like that play a really important role in trying to change society and change attitudes. And I think the more we get, the better it'll become for us as a society.
Shaun Bailey, just to play devil's advocate for a second, because that's kind of my role here, and I don't necessarily believe a word of what I'm about to say. But, I mean, being gay has nothing to do with Tom Daley's abilities as a swimmer, so why would he even mention it in a press conference?
One, he's a diver, not a swimmer.
Sorry,
Two,
you're right, absolutely right.
I think
I said I wouldn't believe what I said.
Fair enough. I think this is the issue. He's not using the Olympics as the platform. The Olympics is why we know of him. This is about him, and it's a very big part of who he is. It's the same about me. I don't go around telling everybody I'm black, but if I'm in a place, it's quite obvious I'm black, and I have issues for the black community that I will elevate. The thing here is twofold. Should we politicise sport? Probably not. Should a person be able to use the platforms that they have access to because of the success they have? Yes, and I'd argue that people regularly do that. Tom is a shining example of that. He's spoken about his issues for years. The problem we have in this country is we have a real inability to agree to disagree. We have people on the internet who... I'm not sure what they're trying to achieve, because that level of a vitriol and attack doesn't move the conversation on. I saw it with the England football team. I remember tweeting about a goal. I then got in trouble because I didn't tweet about the captain who was white. Apparently I was only tweeting about the goal scorer who's black. I was tweeting about the goal, let's be clear. And when the captain scored, white as he is, I tweeted about him as well. I think people just they're angry and they want to have that outlet. Why I think it's important to use these platforms, we cannot beat people by cancelling them. If we cancel people, it festers, it grows, they form little bubbles and echo chambers, and it turns into something really nasty. We've got to take people on in the open, and that's why people like Tom and other politicians and everybody else who's been brave enough to take people on, I think that they're performing a useful function for society.
David, I could tell from the way you put your question, you feel really strongly about this.
Very emotional, yeah. Like, I love those responses. That was amazing. But yeah, I just felt quite emotional by it, really.
Well, I think a lot of people do. Thank you very much for putting the question. Lots of questions to come. 0345 6060 973. We'll take a break while we all recover from the revelation that Shaun Bailey is black. It's 17 minutes past 8.
LBC.
Let's
Past 8. Lots of questions coming in. 0345 6060 973. We have Professor Anand Menon with us, Ian Birrell, Baroness Brinton and Shaun Bailey. Let's go to Mike in Beverley. Hello, Mike.
Hi, Ian. Thanks for having me on. Does the panel think that the Prime Minister has made a political mistake by threatening students and young people with consequences if they don't take the vaccine?
Anand.
Well, at the moment, it's only a threat. There's been no action taken. I think the major pressure on the Prime Minister over this, to be honest, comes from inside his own party, which is why I don't think they'll do it. I think the big pushback is from a number of Tory MPs who would hate to see vaccine passports or the like imposed on students. So I think at the moment, I will give the Prime Minister the benefit of the doubt and say that this is a tactic meant to try and induce young people to get the jab so that those sorts of measures wouldn't be necessary. And if that works, then all credit to him.
So, Ian Birrell, it's one of these classic nudge theory measures.
Well, it does, of course, bring in two of the big issues now, which is one is vaccine passports and whether they're, how we're going to grapple with that issue. And the other is the success of what we're seeing now or otherwise, which is Britain sort of leading the way and trying to live with the virus. And in a way that your question throws up both of those things in one. Personally, I think the vaccine passport is something which we are going to see, whether we like it or not. It seems to be coming down the rails, and that does throw up a lot of very profound questions that we need to talk about and think about.
The problem with it, though, is that the messaging on it has been so mixed. I remember a few months ago, Nadeem Zahawi appeared on a programme one day saying, no, we're ruling it out, and then a couple of days later had to do a complete reverse ferret. And we don't really know what the government's intention is here, whether they really think they would be useful or whether they're just issuing a bit of a threat.
But in a way, that's the heart of the whole problem with the government's handling of the pandemic. Really, it's been all about the messaging being so confused. It was very clear in the first few weeks. Then we had the Don Cummings situation. Ever since then, I think the messaging has been terribly, terribly confused. And that's one thing I really noticed. It's very striking when I was in Sweden, obviously another controversial handling of the pandemic. But there they had such clear messaging, and everyone I spoke to on the streets knew what the government message was, and whether they agreed or disagreed, at least there was a clarity of that message. And I think I don't think anyone could tell you what the government's message is on virtually anything to do with the pandemic right now, and it's been that way for several months. And I think that's the really big failing of this government on the pandemic.
Shaun Bailey.
I think we need a reset. We need to say to people, we're going to live with this. I think Corona's here to stay, and we need to live with it in a way we live with flu, etc. And in order to do that, we need a reset, and we need to be very, very clear about what that reset is, when, where, why, and how. I think it'd really help the public to move forward. As for students, the challenge for us as a nation is we have young people who are not affected by this. They're relatively they don't become very unwell if they get COVID, etc. But they could be moving around to more vulnerable people. So we have to ask everybody to be responsible. So a little nudge in the right direction is useful. But I go back to the thing, if you're going to nudge people, tell them where they're going. Be very clear about it. Say this is the goal. We do need some flexibility because this is unprecedented waters. We've never dealt with a pandemic in modern times. But to be clear, this is what we're asking and here's why. If you can tell people why you're doing a thing, even if they don't agree, at least they can understand and then support that in the long term.
Brinton, the Lib Dems have been very clear about vaccine passports. It's the only political party, I think, that have taken a position either for or against. Labour and Conservatives seem to be quite split on it. You as a party are very much against them. But what about, going back to the question, has Boris Johnson made a political error taking on students over vaccinations?
Yeah, I think he probably has. I think part of that is because of the messaging that Ian was talking about just isn't clear. The one thing that is being really picked up at the moment is that the thing that young people do get from COVID is long COVID. And whilst they may not end up on a ventilator, and thankfully the deaths are much, much lower than they were before, what we do know about long COVID is that people can become really unwell for quite a long time. I mean, we've only had COVID with us for a year, and there are plenty of people who've had it for a year and cannot work. We've got doctors who've had it who are in the process of losing their jobs because they're essentially off on the long-term sick. So what we Lib Dems say is actually the core message should have been and should remain manage how we stop the virus. And the problem with the vaccine passports, the biological problem with the vaccine passports, is that you can still get COVID even if you've been double jabbed. That's part of the problem. It isn't the safety net. It is fantastic. It will reduce things, but it isn't the absolute answer, which means we need to continue with all the other things that Boris got rid of last week. We still need face masks on public transport. We still need, for some people like myself, I'm one of the 3.8 million people, I'm still having to shield because the government says it's not safe for me to go out until they found a solution. I've been told I must not go into any environment where there is somebody who hasn't had both vaccinations and who might get closer to me than 1 meter. And so for 5% of the population, they're watching this saying, I didn't have a freedom day last week. And actually, everyone who thinks that vaccine passports are the magic answer are much mistaken. And I certainly wouldn't want to take students on. What we should be doing is communicating with very, very strongly with young people to say it's actually for your own benefit as well to get vaccinated. Please do. I'm on the all-party coronavirus group, and I've heard a lot of evidence from young people with long COVID. It is not good news.
Mike in Beverley, well, your answer to your own question.
Yeah, I agree. The messaging and communication is atrocious. And rather than being a nudge, I think this is something of a bluff. And you can only bluff students who are not the least intelligent element of the community so often before they don't start to believe you. And I think that's where the political damage over the years will come in.
OK, Mike, thank you. A couple of texts in reaction to what you've all been saying. Bob says, would a stop on rich guys going on space jollies help climate change? Interesting question. Someone else says, I don't think we in the West quite appreciate the industrial scale on which troll farms from the East are working to dismantle Western civilization from the inside on behalf of their paymasters. We merrily discuss the hideous views expressed online as though they're all indigenous, and they simply aren't. We're helping our enemies achieve their goal. And Jay says, I think the negativity regarding celebrities using their platforms comes from the sense that they can only use their platform for certain kinds of opinions on certain kinds of topics. If there was a footballer who cared about the issue of immigration and had concerns about rising numbers or the problem of integration, etc., I can't see them feeling secure in their job to speak out. As a result, we only see a certain kind of opinion repeated ad nauseum. It comes across as a little cultish and it gets people's backs up. A text from Jean in Driffield. Should the former nurse who compared our NHS heroes to Nazi war criminals be prosecuted? Now, this is quite an interesting one. I think it was, I don't know where was it on Hyde Park Corner she said this, or at a protest at the weekend? It was in Trafalgar Square, apparently. Should she be prosecuted, presumably, for some sort of hate crime? Ian Birrell.
I mean, I have no idea whether she's broken a law or not. That would be up to the police. I just think it's rather sad, A, that she says such things, and B, that so many people go along and attend rallies and clap and cheer and think that she is someone worth listening to. She's not unique. Of course, it was like a sort of horror lineup, wasn't it, with her and some of the other speakers there. But equally, we're seeing the same thing in other countries. France, I think, had 140,000 people turn out to a rally, whereas some people were wearing yellow stars, which is just so offensive. The idea that these people are, comparing themselves to the victims of the Holocaust is just disgusting, I think. And it's just very sad reflection that so many people go along and take her as remotely credible in anything she's saying.
She phoned into LBC yesterday and wanted to come on the air to defend her views, and I said to the producer, don't put her through. I'm not interested in a single word she has to say. Was I right to do that, Shaun?
No, you weren't, because that's what gives her energy. That's what makes her right. That's where...
No, giving her energy is the oxygen of publicity.
No. For the people who turn up to her rally, for the people who are trying to rationalise in their mind why they hold on to those views, the first thing they'll say is, they've cancelled us. They won't even listen to you. I remember many years ago when I first got involved in politics, they brought me to an event and there was a guy there from the BNP, and they asked him to leave because I was there, and I begged for him to stay. And the organiser said, why? I said, if you send him out the door, his supporters will just say, see, this is why we have to support you. You leave him sat in front of me and I'll demonstrate why he's wrong. And to her credit, she left him there. We had the conversation. I'd like to believe I won. But the point was, you cannot just cancel people because it gives them fuel. And also, who gets to pick who should be cancelled or not? It's my programme. Well, of course. But one of your listeners has just written in very eloquently about, the homogeneity of views, and that in itself becomes a really big problem. We must be able to speak about things that are uncomfortable as a society, or we'll never resolve them.
Sal Brinton, you are a Liberal. The Liberal Democrats, I sometimes think, aren't particularly liberal, but on this, do you agree with Shaun? Because that would be the Liberal thing to do, wouldn't it?
The Liberal view would be to say, does it harm others? And the boundary is when someone encourages thousands of people in Trafalgar Square or wherever this was, and online, to think that it is fair game to hang doctors and nurses, because that was what she was suggesting, that it was appropriate. And the problem is that there's one thing about people with firm, very clear views, and I agree that we have to learn as a society how to disagree well. But when there happens to be a threat to individuals, and that's what the police will be looking at, I have no idea if it reached their boundary. But I'm actually with you on this one, Ian. If I'd been in your shoes, I would not have had her on, because I just think that, having watched the responses from doctors and nurses on social media, on various other programs, there is a real distress about the distortion of what they're doing in hospitals. That's what's so horrific. And frankly, to then encourage people to perhaps take the law into their own hands, that would be dreadful. And this is the problem. I mean, certainly America, if you think about January the 6th, you can talk about radicalization. The moment it starts to drift into violence or threats of violence are where the boundaries are. And we are living in difficult times trying to work those out. That's the problem.
Anand?
I mean, I don't know whether she's broken any laws or not, so I can't make a judgment of whether she'd be arrested or not. In general, I'm in favour of the power of rational debate. That is to say, I would rather confront someone I disagreed with head on and try and win the argument than let them go away saying I was running scared and didn't want to hear their views. If they're going to come, but there needs to be sort of limits to that. The limits need to be you don't come on and start issuing threats against health service workers. If you want to talk about the substance of the issues, that's absolutely fine. But here, actually, going back to our earlier discussion, what I don't understand is why the government isn't flooding the airwaves and social media with big name music stars, football stars, you name it, whoever they can rustle up, coming out and saying, look, the vaccine is safe. You need to get vaccinated to protect you against COVID. It seems to me the government could do a lot more to make its case as noisily as the opponents are.
Good point. Thank you very much indeed. Hope, Jean, you're satisfied with those answers. We'll answer more questions in just a moment on Cross Question with Anand Menon, Ian Birrell, Baroness Sal Brinton and Shaun Bailey. It's 8:32 on LBC. Time for the news headlines with Simon English.
The number of centres where people who've been pinged can get daily COVID testing in England is being increased from 800 to 2,000. It means they can keep working if they're negative. Prisons, waste collection and defence sites are among the new ones being added. The United States says it'll finish its combat mission in Iraq at the end of 2021. It's more than 18 years since American troops were sent into the country to topple former leader Saddam Hussein. Team GB are celebrating winning 3 gold medals in Tokyo 2020. Adam Peaty defended his Olympic title in the 100-metre breaststroke before Tom Daley and Matty Lee's win in the men's synchronised 10-metre diving. Tom Pidcock got gold in the cross-country mountain biking. And the weather, showery rain in Northern Ireland will move into western Scotland and England this evening. Most other areas staying dry. Showers becoming widespread tomorrow with warm spells in between. A high of 22.
LBC.
Where
56. I can't really read this. Zaid on Twitter says, you were wrong for not allowing them to speak. Not even trying to understand the other side causes them to be more radical. I understand that argument, but if you've got a point to make, you can make it in a reasonable way. You don't have to invoke the Nuremberg trials and say that nurses and doctors should be hanged. That doesn't deserve an airing, to my mind, by the person who said it on national media. I accept that there are different points of view, but that's where I personally will draw a line. Now, you're all being very concise in your answers today. In fact, you're an excellent panel on that front, because there's normally at least one panellist who goes on for ages and ages, but you're all doing terribly well, which means we can get through more questions. 0345 6060 973. If you've just tuned in, we're with Professor Anand Menon, Ian Birrell, Baroness Brinton and Shaun Bailey. Another text question from Janice in Durham. President Biden is to end the US military's combat mission in Iraq by the end of the year, after coming to an agreement with the Iraqi Prime Minister. Has the mission been a success or a failure? Ian Birrell, as our specialist international correspondent.
It's been the most unbelievable failure, utter catastrophe that's done untold damage. And I think we should never forget the damage that it's done. You know, it gave birth to all the extremist groups like ISIS. It's wrecked the Middle East. And it's just, it's impossible to see it as anything other than disastrous. The consequences are still being suffered. When we look at all the events happening in terms of migration, a lot of that is down to it all goes back to the invasion of Iraq. You know, and in fact, Britain needs to think about this when it talks about the migration issue. I know it's a very controversial issue and a hot topic, but actually a lot of these people have come here because of extremist groups and because of breakdown of societies, which is a direct consequence of British and American invasion of Iraq.
Shaun?
I don't know enough about the international scene that's happening here in Iraq. Obviously, people know that I'm focused on home politics and London. But I will say this, history will judge if it was a success or not by what's left behind. And when you look at the world now and the amount of migrants across the world, immigrants, people moving around, you have to look at what is driving that. And if that's part of the process, it would suggest, if this is part of the reason, it would suggest that we probably wouldn't want to repeat that action. But like I say, it's not a piece of political pie that I'm fully knowledgeable of.
Sal?
I completely agree with Ian. I mean, I think we do have 20 years behind us. I love it when people say that.
IAN, not IAIN.
I meant the other Ian.
Yeah,
sorry.
I know.
But seriously, I mean, you know, for those of us who were around, and I remember my children watching when the two towers came down, and I think the idea of understanding that the wars that would follow that in order to get revenge, which is what happened, have left two countries, not just Iraq but Afghanistan as well, in a complete mess. And our intervention was completely the wrong thing to do, and we will have to live with that for a long time to come. My grandfather was one of the First World War RAF pilots who then ended up in Iraq just after the new borders were created in the very early 1920s. And even then, they were trying to police the impossible, the borders that we created, not the people who lived there, and not understanding what was going on. And 100 years later, it is just shameful that our intervention have caused so many deaths and such political disturbance that the world is still reeling from it. And it's not just the what's going on there, but it is also about the vast movements of people and the continued persecution of people as well. It's dreadful.
Anand?
Well, it's been a failure, I think, and for the reasons that Ian laid out. And I'd also add to what Ian said about immigration and Iraq, the implications of David Cameron's intervention in Libya for immigration across the Mediterranean that have been absolutely disastrous. What we have to be aware of, though, is creating the worst of all worlds. Intervention was wrong. It's had disastrous consequences, but simply cutting and running because we've decided we want our troops home, as I think we're going to find out in Afghanistan to our cost, might simply mean that the people who we were trying to keep out take over. And actually, we need to have a view to what we leave behind. The West has a long and sad history of intervening in places and then leaving because they've had enough without thinking through the conditions they leave behind when they go. And I just hope that this isn't something that is going to be rushed and done with a view to American politics rather than the situation on the ground in Iraq. And the final thing I'd say is we shouldn't sort of overcompensate on the back of that. There have been instances, and I'm thinking about Tony Blair and Sierra Leone, where intervention can actually help and it can do some good. And I think it would also be wrong if we draw the conclusion from Iraq, we should just ignore the world around us from now on because there's nothing good we should do.
That is an interesting point, isn't it, Sal? Because, Sierra Leone is one example, Kosovo is another. I gather Tony is the most common Christian name now for Kosovan children. So in awe are they of Tony Blair. We concentrate on the failures, but we very rarely talk about the successes.
I think that's very fair. And in fact, I was talking just the other day to a woman soldier, a young woman soldier who was in Afghanistan 10 years ago, who was really proud that part of her role being there would help the improvement of women in Afghanistan. And she's in despair now. She sees all of that being undone. But you're right. I mean, Kosovo was a success story, and it's still taken years to settle down. But it was limited, clear intent, support of the UN, which I think was also important as well. But the problem is America and us went into Iraq for the wrong reasons and pulling out too fast because we don't want any more damage to us. And that is a real issue.
And I don't want to rake over our calls too much, Ian, but of course I remember at the time, and in fact I think it was on LBC, when there was all the debate about were there weapons of mass destruction. Tony Blair insisted that they were. And I can remember saying, I think it was Sandy Toksvig, who was the presenter at the time, I remember saying to her, well, I believe there are weapons of mass destruction because I believe my Prime Minister. But if there aren't, this is going to have severe consequences for future interventions in the future.
Which, of course, it did. But I think what we've got to do is look at each intervention in its own respect. Sierra Leone was actually done almost despite Tony Blair. If you look at actually what happened, it was led really by a military operation which was remarkably successful with a very small force. Kosovo was very successful because it was done as part of a unified strategy that was thought through. Afghanistan was meant to be a brief intervention to throw out the Taliban, throw out the government that was supporting them. Then the grounds for being there kept changing. I remember Tony Blair saying at one stage it was there to eliminate the heroin production, which obviously hasn't happened. Another time we were told there wouldn't be any British troops involved in fighting, and the reasons for being there kept changing. There's only, if we were going to stay, yes, it is great that women can go to school in certain places, but that can only last if you're going to be prepared to be there for the very long haul, if you're actually wanted by the people there, and if you have a strategy. The strategy has kept changing. I don't agree on Libya. I think Libya, the difference was that I was in Libya before the revolution. I was there when Tripoli fell. The difference there is people really wanted Gaddafi out. It was a really nasty, corrupt regime. And the involvement of British and French forces, and to a lesser extent Americans, was very popular. There were then elections afterwards, and the moderates won the elections, but they said they didn't want outside help. And that's where a lot of the problems stem from. It's very easy to conflate what happened with Libya, which has been disastrous, with what happened in Iraq.
Well, we covered a lot of ground there. We'll come to more questions in a moment. Cindy, going back to our previous discussion, says you should have taken her call and dismantled her ideas in your usual calm and reasonable manner. Graham, on the other hand, says, loving this discussion, you were totally right to not allow her airtime. Would you allow on a Holocaust denier? That is the best argument. And I think, Shaun, you'd probably agree with that one, wouldn't you?
Yes, look, again, we've used the term reasoned debate. I believe you should have reasoned debate. And I always worry who watches the Watchmen, who gets to say whose views are extreme or whose views shouldn't be listened to. That's why I'm always in favour of the debate. And I believe in the goodness of people. I think the vast majority of people will hear a reasoned argument with our shared sort of understanding of what it is to be a human and come down on the right side of it. But you have to have that conversation. Remember, democracy means free speech, and democracy is the least worst way to run a country. It's not clean, it's not easy, but it is the best way.
It's 8:46.
This is LBC. From
8:39 is the time. Our panel tonight, Anand Menon from UK in a Changing Europe, Ian Birrell, a journalist, Baroness Brinton, former president of the Liberal Democrats, and Shaun Bailey, Conservative member of the Greater London Assembly. Well, Kieran in Cork has a question which is going to challenge you all. Kieran, go ahead. Hi.
Hi, how are you doing? I'd just like to qualify my question first by saying, although I'm ringing from the Republic, I'm not asking from a nationalist Republican United Ireland perspective, just to make sure that people understand this. Rather than the British government, Johnson and Scott, using Protestants and Catholics as cannon fodder in the Northern Ireland Protocol debate, why doesn't the government tell the British people that 11 billion is spent every year in Northern Ireland, as opposed to the 8.6 billion that was spent every year to the EU? And secondly, why don't they explain to Protestants that, or to Catholics and Protestants, that Northern Ireland would be an effective duty-free zone in the North Atlantic if the Northern Ireland Protocol was implemented as is?
Why do you say that the British government is using Catholics against Protestants as cannon fodder?
Well, essentially, it's from our standpoint, and I watch British media closely, and I lived in Britain for 4 years. Essentially, you can see that they're using the old style of, essentially divide and rule, and it's kind of keeping. I think this government is like any populist government at the moment, using a tactic of constructive ambiguity in all matters, really, so that they can actually manipulate the situation to their own ends. And they're being purposely ambiguous about everything, including what their negotiation stances are with the EU, when they're satisfied, and when the negotiations have concluded. I mean, the EU agreement was made, and now they want to renegotiate the whole thing, and they're using Northern Ireland as a bargaining chip in that, really.
Well, let's go to Anand Menon, our resident expert on all matters Brexit.
Hi, Kieran. I mean, there's two things there. I think on the first, you're absolutely right. If the government from the start had sold the protocol as giving Northern Ireland the best of both worlds, that is to say, access to both.
Well, they did. They did. That was what Brandon.
No. They sold it. They sold it as the best of all worlds in a different way. They sold it as the best of all worlds by denying the fact that it would mean any difference at all to the trading relationship between Northern Ireland and GB. Now, that was just false. The initial things that the Prime Minister said about being no checks have been proven not to be the case. But there is a different case, a slightly different case that could have been made, which is, look, your trading relationship with GB is going to change, but you will be unique in the world in the sense that you will have this unparalleled access to two markets. The GB market, which is your major market, but also this massive EU single market at the same time. But the government, curiously enough, made no attempt to sell the protocol on its merits. They attempted to sell the protocol on the basis of a distorted version of what it did. So that's the first thing. And I pretty much agree with Kieran on that. On the second thing, I don't think there's an explicit divide and rule policy on the part of the UK government, but I do think there is a danger in the approach they're taking. In that command paper they released last week, they spent an awful lot of time talking about disgruntled unionists who were protesting. And that did two things. Firstly, it ignored the bulk of the population in Northern Ireland, many of whom are trying to make the protocol work, many of whom are ordinary business people who want it to work. But secondly, it gave succor to those unionists who think the more we protest, the stronger the UK's government's position is going to be in negotiations with the European Union. And that is a recipe for greater instability in Northern Ireland. I think that's potentially quite dangerous.
Sal?
I think that's a very good reading of what's happened. And I was in the virtual chamber watching as David Frost answered questions on this command paper last week. And I think the problem is that the government thinks that it has the ability to rewrite the Northern Ireland Protocol. And I think it's discovering it's not quite as easy as it thought it would be. And I'm pretty sure the EU really isn't going to want that to happen. They've already made some very small concessions, but I can't see that happening. Whereas in the meantime, the divides between the communities in Northern Ireland seem to be very, very tense at the moment. Because we don't always see them on our TVs every night in the news, but I'm certainly aware, talking to friends and colleagues in Northern Ireland, that there are a lot of worries, particularly for parties like the Alliance, who are trying to bridge that gap between the Unionists and Sinn Féin. And I'm extremely concerned about it. And wearing my health spokesperson hat in the House of Lords, we have asked a lot of questions about even the practical health arrangements under the Northern Ireland Protocol, which continue to this day. And some ways of working have been found, but it's not easy. Whereas prior to Brexit, it was absolutely seamless. I mean, unlike the rest of Europe, there was a completely seamless arrangement between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, with people going from Northern Ireland to the Republic and vice versa for cancer treatment, for other things as well. And we've just lost all of that at a stroke. And I know that people are very angry about that.
Shaun?
I think the first thing that has to be worked on, we've got to keep the tension between the two communities low. We've got to keep those communities intact. Nobody needs me to explain the pain that Ireland and Northern Ireland have been through, this country's been through, to get to this point where the communities could exist. So for me, that should be the major goal. And of course, when you talk about anything Brexit, it was all politics, wasn't it? And people said lots of things to achieve what was their larger goal. It's typical campaign stuff. You say this and we'll sort it out later. Well, now you have to sort it out. And it wasn't quite as simple as it was stated in earlier times.
So Boris Johnson shouldn't have said those things about nothing's going to change.
No, what Boris and the cabinet should I hope were aware of and would be aware of is just how difficult this is all going to be. But that's the goal of politics.
Do you think they were aware of the difficulties but pretended that things would be easy, or do you think it's actually come as a bit of a shock to them?
I think they know how hard it's going to be. There's enough expertise within the civil service, within the political
So they
parties.
basically lied to us?
No, I think they were generous in their terms to say, look, we're going to get this done. If we're going to campaign and win this campaign and make these things happen. Remember, this is a political belief. This is what people think should be happening. It's a series of events. You've got to march through those events, aren't you? And you would know that the last phase, the technical phase, as the Baroness said, working out things like health, making sure that all the borders are in a way that business can trade and work. You know that would be the tough piece.
Okay.
And they should get on with it.
Ian?
I think this shows why Boris Johnson is so unsuitable to be Prime Minister, as Dominic Cummings, his own chief aide until recently, has been arguing so strongly recently. He knew exactly what the issues were. He was warned about the issues. He ignored them. He bludgeoned ahead. He claimed he'd solved them. And now there are big problems emerging, all of which were predictable, all of which were foreseeable, and all of which he ignored. And what does he do? He blames everyone else for these problems. None of it is his fault. It's all other people's fault. And the result of that sort of populist approach, that selfish approach, which is all about Boris Johnson, is that you get fissures opened up, and it could be potentially very dangerous in a volatile situation like that. So what we have is a perfect example of Boris Johnson's ineptitude at best.
Kieran, very briefly from you.
Well, what I think is the background of all this is the Good Friday Agreement, in which both the Irish and British governments sacrificed sovereignty and agreed that both Catholics and Protestants could decide through their own referendum what they wanted to be, where they wanted to go, and the status of Northern Ireland. That's the background, and that's not going to change. Do you know what I mean?
Kieran, I don't know if you were listening on Saturday morning when I was standing in for Matt Fry, but we did a brilliant hour-long phone-in on the possibility of the reunification of Ireland, which, if you missed it, I think you might enjoy it. It's on the Global Player or My Whole Show podcast. Thank you very much indeed for a really interesting question. I was going to go to David in Sheffield, but we've kind of run out of time. So, David, we're going to get you on tomorrow night's programme if you're free, because you've got a very unique question which we haven't covered on the show before. So I'm keen to get you on, but I don't want to then give everyone 20 seconds to answer it, because it's not a question you can answer in 20 seconds. It's about dog theft, believe it or not. Final text question, though, from Abigail in Southampton. With Team GB doing so well at the Olympics, which event would the panel like to take part in? Shaun Bailey, I know what your answer is going to be.
I was a gymnast for 22 plus years, so I should say gymnastics. But unbelievably, I'm a massive synchronised swimming fan.
Oh, my God.
It just looks so
You're
wonderful.
Dead to me now.
I'd love to try. I'd love to.
It should be banned as an Olympic sport, in my view.
It's a great sport.
It really isn't.
That and archery.
It's not a sport.
I do love a bit of archery.
OK. Sal Brinton.
Well, I sit next to Tanny Gray-Thompson in the House of Lords, and I've never done any wheelchair racing. I use a wheelchair, but I think I'd love to try that.
Anand Menon?
Well, I'd be rubbish at everything, but a mate of mine on Twitter today had a great suggestion, which is for every race on the track, they should have a volunteer from the audience to run alongside them, just to show everyone how fast the real athletes really go. And I think that would be a fantastic idea.
You know, it's really funny you should say that, because next week on Cross Question, we're going to have 2 LBC listeners on each panel. So we'll see if they outshine the professional commentators. They are being selected. They're being selected as we speak. I don't know if I should invite bids from listeners, but if you want to get in touch, please do. Ian Birrell, what would you do?
Very glad they're not here. Rather boringly, I'm afraid I play football 2 or 3 times a week, so I'd probably, even though I'm not sure why it's an Olympic sport, I'd probably play football, which is dull. But
yeah, I don't think it should be an Olympic sport.
No, I don't either.
It doesn't feel
and
right,
particularly not when someone from my own team is there and not going to be there, with Richarlison there at the start of the season.
Right. Look, it's been a great cross question. You've been a fantastic panel, very concise in your answers, so thank you very much for that. Shaun Bailey, Sal Brinton, Anand Menon and Ian Birrell. On the programme tomorrow, we have Freddie Sayers, the editor of Unheard.com, former Conservative Cabinet Minister Andrea Leadsom, my colleague Denise Headley will be with us, and former Labour strategist Andrew Fisher will be joining us too. Coming up in a moment, we want your adoption stories, because the government have announced a new adoption strategy today. I want to know how difficult it is to adopt in this country at the moment. Should the system be changed to make it easier? And if you've been through the system over the past, 5 to 10 years, tell me what you think should be changed. But we'd quite like to have some heartwarming adoption stories as well. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 9 o'clock.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, the number of daily COVID testing centres in England, which workers can use instead of isolating, is being increased by 1,200. People in certain essential industries who are